Thank you very much. It's a very great pleasure to be here, and I feel slightly honoured to be in such a rarefied atmosphere of so many academics. As an environmental scientist, way back when, I sort of feel I so partly come home, but it's also a great pleasure to be participating in this debate. The perspective I'm going to give you is from one of an organisation that's Forum for the Future that has a very clear mission, and that is to do nothing less than to create a sustainable future. So my perspective is one of very much a strong sustainability lens, but also a lens of the understanding that actually the change that we see today, and we've heard this echo throughout the afternoon, just doesn't match up with the scale of the challenge. And our approach at Forum for the Future today is really focused on trying to understand how do we create system level change. And so we use the word system innovation as a way of describing how we get change that is systemic in nature, long-lasting and transformative. And system innovation is really a set of interactions, and it comes from the understanding that there is no silver bullet for a sustainable future. There's a range of things that need to happen in concert to create significant change. And so that perspective really says to me, and as I was thinking today about how do I respond to what I'm about to hear, and what is going to be my angle, and I think that what I've heard today just reinforces what I was thinking earlier today, which is I wonder whether the challenge is actually one of innovation per se, but whether or not the challenge is actually one of scaling up. My view is based upon working in the private sector, working in the third sector, working in the public sector. Forum is in that special space in the system where we're able to talk to different parts of the global economy, if you will. I see lots of what I would call pioneering practice, lots of innovation. But what I don't see it happening is scaling up to create a tipping point where we get a movement to deliver a shift. And we have a campaign at the Forum for the Future right now called The Big Shift, which is something we'd like to see. We're not seeing that momentum to create a big shift towards a more sustainable future. And so, I think that, and I'll come on to critical success factors for new innovation policy, I suspect that the real challenge is one of scaling up. How do you scale up all of this innovation? There's brilliant examples that Charles has just shared with us. They are brilliant, but they're not to scale. And therefore, without some kind of scaling up, will they deliver the impact in the way that we need to see? Question mark. And that's why one of the areas that we've been focusing on at Forum for the last 18 months is on scaling up. And what we've done with support from a foundation is to analyse where significant changes happened in the past, focusing on sustainable development type changes. So we've crawled over M-Pesa and worked out how did that scale up. We've crawled over Marine Stewardship Council and looked at how did they go from kind of quite a sort of niche existence to actually now being on the front of many of the packets of fish that we buy. So how has scaling up happened in the past? And actually, we've looked specifically at what market-based mechanisms you need to work with the grain of to get scaling up. And we've identified 8 market-based mechanisms that can facilitate scaling up, and only one of them is product and service innovation, because the others are around advocacy, so influencing policy, as Sandy was talking about earlier. That's critical to scaling up. Another, for example, is about reshaping supply lines so that you can actually get the flow through of some of these new products to market more effectively. Another critical one is around creating end-user demand. One of the biggest barriers to mainstreaming sustainable goods and services to market in any developed and developing part of the world is actually end-user demand. People are not crying out for sustainable goods and services. And until we create that demand, then we've got a barrier that we need to deal with. So there's therefore a range of things that can happen to harness the market mechanisms to get this scaling up. And that's part of the solution, but the other part of the solution is something that Charles touched on, which is collaboration. And so phase 1 of our scaling up works looked at how you can harness market mechanisms. Phase 2 is moving into that right now, where we're going to try and create what we call living labs, where we're going to invite participants from civil society, from business, from the public sector, to come together to try and understand how their collaboration can create collective impact at scale. So I'm happy to tell people more about this project if you're interested. but it's a genuine attempt to try and understand how do we take these innovations and scale them up. But this phase 2, the Living Labs, is about understanding that there are different solutions in a system, and unusual collaborations can often provide real benefits and real potential for change. So that's just a little thought about scaling up and very specific things that can happen. But I also think that scaling up innovation requires us to address one key barrier and to really perhaps think a bit hard about one enabler. And the enabler might be slightly more controversial. But one key barrier, actually this might be controversial as well, is patent policy. So that was devised how many years ago now? Andy, you probably know, decades. In a world where we need to really rapidly prototype, rapidly scale, get these innovations to scale, to deal with these big mega sustainability trends, the current patent system is really unuseful and really, I think, needs addressing. That's what I would describe as a key systemic barrier. But then an enabler. We've talked this afternoon about the incumbents and power bases, but I actually think there's an enabler sitting there in the mix at the moment, and that is the assets of some of these big companies. They have the fixed assets at the moment. They have the superhighways that can take some of these entrepreneurial ideas, some of these innovations, and scale really quickly. Look what happened when Avis bought Zipcar. Suddenly, Zipcars get the market scale that they didn't have before. So how might we therefore think about these assets of these big multinationals that are often kind of finger pointed at, saying, you're part of the problem? How might they, by providing this superhighway for innovation, become an enabler? There are also two practical things that I think we all need to think much harder about really delivering. And I think we've touched on a couple of these already, but just to spell them out. The first is have a go, experiment. I think it's much easier to talk about innovation than it is to do it. And right now we have an experiment running with Ecover. They make soaps and laundry products and so on, where on the island of Mallorca, I'm not quite sure why it's Mallorca, but I'm sure there's a very good reason, we're taking all the end products of the olive groves and putting them in a big bioreactor to make the first closed-loop soap. Doesn't sound terribly interesting. However, it's a demonstration of how you can create a place-based closed-loop system. So we're having a go. We're learning as we're doing. And then the second practical thing we should think about is how do we make the most of what we already have? And in this innovation space, there's a real desire to invent new terms and to be quite funky and kind of be the next new thing. But actually, we already have a lot of the solutions, and Charles touched on this as well. Make amend, that's inherently sustainable. And actually, there's a lot of innovation when you think about how you make do amend, repairing, recycling, upcycling. Let's make that a little bit more sexy. So finally then, how do we ensure that future innovation policy will deliver a sustainable future? Based upon what I've heard this afternoon and what I thought already, but I have iterated this afternoon. James probably had a bit of a shock when he saw my notes. They're a bit messy. 5 critical factors, therefore, for future innovation policy. Number 1, be outcome-based. Ask, what is this innovation designed to do? We just don't ask that question often enough. Number 2, future innovation policy needs to facilitate open and democratic innovation, to pick up some of the points from Andy. It needs to get what I would call the system in a room. It needs to provide a space in the system where the different actors can come together and create new solutions. Number 3, to pick up a point made earlier today, good innovation policy needs to enable fusion, different skills, different perspectives, different power regimes as well, because that's how you get real system level change. It also needs to encourage closed-loop thinking. We heard a lot about that from Charles. In the future, and Forum for the Future spends a lot of the time looking at the future, as you might imagine, there's no waste. So any innovation needs to be predicated on the fact there will be no waste. We will get maximum utility per input of whatever we put into the system. And then finally, no one has spoken about this. This is me adding what I think. Great innovation policy needs to value ecosystem assets and put a real value on us as humans and as individuals. At the moment, our economy is predicated on one financial value metric at the moment. Nature isn't free. We're not free. And so we need good policy that respects the inherent value of the other parts of the system that deliver real progress. And so I think if we can conceive future innovation policy in that way, then for me, I think innovation can move from a promise of a sustainable future, which I think is what it is today, to actually an enabler of a sustainable future.